I'm Emily Hackshaw, Vice President for Community Engagement with Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thanks so much for joining us for this Finding Your Roots conversation about documenting family history in the digital age. We are proud to co-present tonight's event along with stations across the public media system. Tonight's event is part of the Finding Your Roots National Conversation Series of virtual events where members of the show's production team and subject matter experts will discuss the research behind discovering family history. These events cover themes related to genealogy and feature clips from Season 9 of Finding Your Roots, which is airing Tuesday nights on GPB and on PBS stations across the country. You can also stream the new season of Finding Your Roots on the PBS video app and on pbs.org. Now entering its 9th season, Finding Your Roots has helped expand America's sense of itself, stimulating a national conversation about identity with humor, wisdom, and compassion. We'll begin with a trailer for this season. For more information about the series and upcoming conversation events like this one, please visit pbs.org/findingyourroots. We hope you enjoy tonight's conversation.
Fasten your seatbelt.
My heart is racing right now.
Oh, look at now.
We're not gonna have no Danny Trejo, you are the father.
What do you have, spies working for you? How did you find this?
You're uncovering the truth. I love this.
It's wild. These are consequential things.
Okay, mind blown.
I feel like a time traveler. This is something out of some science fiction novel.
Oh, it's so good. Oh, that's so good. Oh my gosh, I cannot believe this.
Wow. That's very moving, actually. It's like the most vital stuff, right?
I'm sorry, but this really something. Really is something. I mean, I wish my ma could be here to see this.
They didn't need Lincoln to free them. They got free on their own.
They did indeed.
They had a hard time even getting my head there.
I just want to bow down to every nick and scrape and trauma and whip and chain and say, just, you have no idea how much I love you.
On this side of your tree, I'm an inbred inbred. I'm inbred.
You can't make that stuff up.
Right.
That's funny, but it's life.
No, my ancestors did not come here on the Mayflower.
Your ancestors came on the Mayflower.
That's a little bit too much.
And you have a DNA cousin.
Oh my God!
That's Bill Hader. You know him?
Of course.
He's my DNA cousin.
He is your DNA cousin.
We worked together.
What?
Yeah, that's right.
That's a good one.
What a treasure. Skip, what a treasure.
You know, you die twice. You die when your body dies, and then you die the last time somebody says your name.
That's right.
And so I'm gonna make sure that I keep them alive.
I've got history. You know what I mean? That's what it is. I've got history. I feel the presence of all these people.
Yeah.
In a good way.
This has been freaking amazing.
It is something about knowing. Even with the hard parts, there's an add value to the knowing. Okay, I don't want my fake eyelashes to fall off.
Hello. Thank you for joining this evening. I'm thrilled to serve as moderator for this first installment of Finding Your Roots, Season 9, National Conversation Series, documenting family history in the digital age. Tonight, we're going to explore how digital technology is changing how we research, record, and share family history. I'm Thomas Allen Harris, creator of the Family Pictures Institute for Inclusive Storytelling, based at Yale University, where I am a professor in the practice in African American Studies and Film and Media Studies. Some of you may recognize me from my own PBS series, Family Pictures USA, which highlights rich local history via treasured family photographs from people across the country, whose stories help expand our understanding of how we're all part of one large, extended American family. Families, blood or extended, can be one of our deepest and most meaningful connections. There is a bond, a sense of greater understanding that comes from sharing memories and stories from previous generations. There is a responsibility to preserve and chronicle documents, pictures, and the like for future generations, to make sure they are not lost over time. But how? And what tools are necessary and available? Undoubtedly, our ever-evolving world of social media and new and consistently updated technology provides endless possibilities, and more information can be accessed through a variety of sources than ever before. But where do we start? To that end, tonight's events will include information and tips on how people can digitize files, responsibly share and make them accessible to family members near and far, and safeguard them for future generations. Our panelists tonight are Tania Kuntz, who is an executive board member for the African American Historical and Genealogical Society, Kimberly N. Morgan, a lead genealogist for Finding Your Roots, Season 9. And we also have Finding Your Roots series producer, Natalia Warkol. Thank you all for being here. It's an exciting season ahead, and I can't wait to dive into tonight's conversation. Without further ado, let's begin. Natalia Warkol, you've been with Finding Your Roots since 2014 and a series producer since 2019. You've uncovered some very interesting stories over the years. When pulling the shows together, how is historical context important in telling the story of each guest's ancestor? And I'm thinking also visually and narratively.
Hi, thanks for having me. So I would like to start with something that Dr. Gates says often, which is that finding your roots helps individualize history for our audiences and for our guests. And he often asks our guests, imagine, knowing this when you were sitting in the classroom during the history lesson and you learned that your ancestor was part of this particular battle in the Civil War or Revolutionary War. How differently, you would absorb that information, and possibly it wouldn't be another boring history lesson. You would, be able to relate to it. It would be something tangible to your life. So same with just what we do on this show, which is we're trying to anchor our guests in a very specific moment in time in the life of their ancestors. So historical context helps them relate to geopolitical situations and contexts that these ancestors lived through. So really history is everything, because you want these guests to understand the life of this individual ancestor within that context, because without that context, it doesn't really mean much, right? You can't really personalize it, or you might not understand how monumental a certain event may have been, or how monumental what your ancestor has done may have been within that point in time that they lived in. Without being long-winded, that's really it's the crux of the show, the history of what these people went through, and the individualized lens that we tell it through. Hope that answered your question.
Yes, it does. But it leads to another question that I have for you, Natalia, and also to Kimberly. Kimberly, you've been active in the field of genealogical historical research for about 20 years and have been working with Natalia and the team at Finding Your Roots for 3 years. Can you tell us about the methodology you use to begin the research process for the guest, and also any factors that might affect the progress of this, the progression of this progress?
Certainly. And thank you for having me. First of all, I want to emphasize that Finding Your Roots is a team effort. Genealogy itself and genealogical research is a community effort. It needs to be a collaborative effort. And that's what it is at Finding Your Roots, just on a much more compact level than usual. So we have a team. Every guest is assigned a team, and a team is a genealogist. There's 3 lead genealogists, so one of us is assigned the guest. There's also a producer like Natalia, associate producer, researchers, and interns. And we all work together to start digging through the guest's family tree and start compiling the contextual history that's necessary to start telling these stories for the guest. And the first thing that I do is every guest receives 2 things, or receives 2 things and gives back 2 things. The first is a questionnaire. We ask them simple questions like, what are your parents' names? What do you know about your family? What do you want to know about your family? Is there a specific story that you're interested in us exploring? Sometimes guests know quite a bit, sometimes they don't. And the other thing that they do is take several DNA tests for us, because we use genetic genealogy, or the study of DNA, to enhance and complement the traditional research process. So I start, or the genealogist that's assigned to the guest, we start digging into the family history with the information the guest gives us. And we do everything online as much as possible. And as we start we're keeping an eye out for like interesting or compelling stories that we think might make it onto the show. And the research team, the production team, is working parallel, working in tandem with us, gathering that contextual history for the research. And we also utilize DNA, as I said, and CC Moore, who's our DNA expert, analyzes the DNA for each guest, and we see if there's anything there to explore. And then once we hit a wall, inevitably, we usually hit a wall with the online research, we then assign or find local researchers, depending on where the guest is from or where their ancestors are from, to do more local brick and mortar type research to finish it off. And then, so we lay that foundation, the genealogists do, and then, as Matthew Cesario, one of our amazing producers, says, the production team builds the mansion on the foundation that we lay. And the mansion is the script, the stories that we tell the guest for the interview. And it can take anywhere from a couple of months to years. A couple of things affect the research process, primarily geographic location. Depending on where your ancestors are from, sometimes, unfortunately, there are not records available due to typically natural disasters and wars. You have Ireland, and a lot of records were destroyed during during their civil war. And in the United States and the South, particularly, you have a lot of record loss due to fires during the Civil War, flooding, different types of natural disasters. That's a big one. And the second one is if we have a guest who has a DNA mystery that they would like us to explore, for instance, Pamela Adlon in season 8. Sometimes, unfortunately, the DNA matches that are available at that time are not good enough to work with, and we have to wait. Pamela Adlon waited 5 years. We eventually solved her mystery, but sometimes that can cause a guest's research to kind of go on the back burner for a bit.
I think that sets up very well for a preview of our upcoming episode of the show, which airs at the end of the month. This clip features actor Brian Cox. Brian's story is so interesting because he learns more about his maternal grandfather, a Scottish Highlander who fought in World War I, through documents that have long been forgotten. Please roll the clip.
Now, I'm sure you've heard of the infamous Western Front.
Yeah.
But did you realize that your grandfather had served there?
No, I had no idea.
How would you have fared? How would you process that experience?
Yeah. No. We were spared that.
Yeah.
We've been spared that.
I would have been crushed.
Yeah. I mean, it's beyond imagination.
Could you please turn the page?
Sure.
Brian, these are excerpts from the War Diary of the 9th Battalion of the Black Watch from late 1915 and early 1916. Now, we believe that your grandfather was in that battalion at the time. Would you please read the transcribed section?
December 11th. Battalion went into the trenches. The trenches were full of water, 2 feet deep in places. February the 20th, between 9 and 10 p.m., heavy artillery firing was heard to the south. March 18th, we were heavily shelled at 11 a.m. and again from 5:30 to 7 p.m. Gas from the shells was distinctly noticed. Yeah. Wow.
And we believe your grandfather was there.
Yeah.
What's it like to read those words, to think of your grandfather actually living through that, experiencing that horror?
I think that explains a lot. It's not a fantasy. It's a reality. And he lived with that harsh reality. You know, I mean, apparently he was a drunk, he drank, and I think it all makes sense. It just makes sense. And he didn't live very long. He died at the age of 50. So he didn't live long, you know, and it doesn't excuse anything, but it fills in a lot about what he was going through and what he went through and how he didn't deal with it, how he couldn't cope with it.
Very few men could cope with what James endured. He and his fellow soldiers were subjected to near constant bombardment. And some of the shells contained poison gas. It would settle in the trenches. Men who breathed too much would find their lungs blistered and burned, if they survived at all. It was one of the most gruesome weapons ever seen on a battlefield. And James may have been one of its victims. 5 months after he arrived in France, he found himself in Harley Hill Hospital in Yorkshire, England.
James McCann, sergeant, age 39, cough, short of breath, 4 days, no duty.
Your grandfather was admitted to the hospital for issues related to his lungs. Did you ever hear anything about that?
No. Wow. No, and this is all new.
His diagnosis was that he was short of breath and he was coughing. So let's see why. Could you please turn the page? Brian, this is your grandfather's pension card, issued to him after the war. Would you please read the transcribed section?
Cough and dyspnea, chronic bronchitis, and emphysema. Degree of disablement, 30%.
So, you know what this means. We spoke to a scholar who told us that your grandfather's symptoms were typical of gas poisoning.
Wow.
What's it like to learn this?
It's relieving, actually, because it's like a ghost has been laid for a while, finally. You know,
good.
You know, that hadn't been laid, you know, that had been so debatable, you know, and especially that he had a particularly bad rap. You know, he was a drunk, he wasn't, you know, and nobody's taken into account any of this.
Yeah, it wasn't his fault.
No.
No.
No, I mean, and it's how he survived. And, oh, boy.
Wow, moving clip. What can you tell us about the ways in which you've incorporated historical and investigative research to dramatize the stories featured on Finding Your Roots in Talia?
Well, I think the clip that we just saw, where Brian Cox learns of his ancestor, is a very good example of how we built up to that moment prior to him turning to that page, right? He wouldn't have the same emotional response had we not first discussed the context of, you know, what was happening in the war at that time. What did the soldiers, like Brian's ancestors, faced every day in those trenches? What weapons of war were used and how they affected people? So, you know, there are several pages of this context, photographs, gruesome photographs, firsthand accounts of soldiers from either the unit that the ancestors served in or other units that served in the area, in the same area. So you're painting that picture in the guest's head, and hopefully when you reach that climactic moment, it really pays off. And I think you see that with Brian, who got really emotional. So that's sort of as good as it gets, right? And that's always the goal. But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. With Brian, it was special because he came to us wanting to know more, and he himself had done years of research on his own with his sister, I believe. Kimberly, correct me if I'm wrong, but he's tried to find this information on his own for years, and he couldn't. And so this was sort of a perfect storm of circumstances and great research and great investigative research that led to that really emotional response in Brian. So that's, I guess, my answer to how we incorporate investigative and contextual research into telling these stories.
Thank you. Tania Kuntz is an enthusiastic genealogist with a long-standing passion for exploring family history and more than 20 years of professional experience in information science, research, and information organization. One of the things you do is to aid genealogy researchers and with strategies to organize their family history materials. We get to learn about Brian's grandfather's life through a war diary, hospital records, and his pension card from World War I over 100 years ago. Tania, what recommendations would you have for someone who's trying to find older historical documents and verify their validity?
Thank you for having me. And yes, that is certainly a very much needed question that many family history enthusiasts and researchers will have. And as we see from Brian on the show, being able to access those documents makes for a quite compelling way to begin to understand where your family fits into the larger historical picture. So, where does one find these documents? Well, when looking for older historical documents, we can first leverage a plethora of websites that are available online, as was discussed by my co panelists, right? Because when we use some of the sites that really are in the business of collating and gathering and making available to us historical documents, the major players, Ancestry, Family Search, Find My Past, My Heritage, all of them, they often work with local and state governments and archives to gather these materials. And those are the sources of these historical documents, and they do their part to make them available to us. So, taking advantage of these large platforms is, of course, an often used first step. Another step in the process is to use the local resources yourself, state archives, state libraries, county courthouses, because they are in the business of collecting these documents for their own record keeping, and then we can take advantage of them as researchers. And often in the case of institutions like libraries and archives, they often go through a process to document the history of something that's been donated to them or in their collections, its origin, how it's journeyed through time, and how it ended up with them. So we can use those details as well to help verify their validity.
Natalia, I think you may be able to speak to how sometimes learning the full picture of a family tree relies on speaking with extended family members.
Yes, that's true. But before I go into that, I do want to give a shout out to the librarians and archivists all over the US and abroad, especially, librarians in our small local libraries. I cannot tell you how many times our stories that we told on Finding Your Roots hinged on those people being just willing to help us, answering an email and being excited. Hey, let me look into this for you. Like, finding things that haven't been digitized that we wouldn't know exist, but just, picking up a phone or just emailing them. I would strongly encourage people to try that. They're there to help. They love their jobs usually, and are very dedicated. So just try that, and they'll be your best friend most of the time. So I just wanted to really give a shout out to all those people. But back to your question, in terms of research for this show, one of the first things we do, Kimberly brought up the genealogy questionnaire that every guest fills out for us, and one of the questions on that questionnaire is we ask them to provide contact information for their relatives who may know a lot about family history. So we definitely utilize that information. We call everyone we can. We talk to everyone we can. And you would be surprised how many different perspectives you can get on one family story by talking to all those people. Just an example would be a family with many siblings, some much older than the youngest ones. Oftentimes, these older siblings got the privilege to meet the elders of the families who may have passed on by the time the younger siblings came, to be. And oftentimes, they were privy to stories that these elders, grandparents, great-grandparents, passed on to them, but not to the younger generation. And oftentimes, you'd also be surprised about how it's not until we ask specific questions about specific stories, people will go like, "You're really interested in that? I didn't think that was interesting. I never really shared that with anyone." So it just illustrates the importance of asking questions, any questions and all questions, before people, pass on, because you just never know what information you're going to get, what incredible stories you may get, even though some people may think of them as inconsequential. So I would just say it's just so important to record this history, especially in the instances where maybe there are no documents that you can rely on because, like Kimberly said, natural disasters, there's parts of the world that just didn't do very diligent record keeping, wars, record loss to whatever, for whatever reason, all you have is oral history. So it is incredibly important to record that and pass that on, because a lot of the times that's all you have. And with dry sort of genealogical records, vital records, death certificates, birth certificates, you're not going to get the juicy details that you're going to get from a storyteller, or sitting on the couch with someone and just talking about that. So I just think it's incredibly important, and it encompasses. It's just everything, especially in maybe societies, like I said, where record keeping wasn't a go-to method. I think back, I forget which season we did Kehinde Wiley. He has roots in Nigeria, and we relied on oral storytelling from the elder of the village where Kehinde's father was from to build that family tree. So it's really, it's everything. That oral history is everything. Same with Southeast Asian ancestry. You have those clan books, the jokbos. It's all oral history put on paper, right? But there are no other documents. So it is this everything. Storytelling, oral history, that's just, I can't even emphasize how important that is.
Natalia, when you're diving into research for guests, what are some of the primary resources that provide the most information?
So I think Kimberly really kind of explained, and Tanea as well, the vast array of what's available out there, right? And so in the ideal situation, if I work with Kimberly on the guest, Kimberly would have done all the genealogy work, right, already before I dive in and try to make a decision about which stories we're going to actually expand on and dramatize and tell our guests. But my favorite primary resource, I have to say, is our newspaper databases. I love obituaries and just random articles about about these ancestors. And I think Kim and I think our favorite stories that we worked on together came from random newspaper articles because we saw something, in an article that was like, what? Let us look into this further. Like there has to be a story there. Or, an obituary that mentioned something very specific. Oftentimes we learn of people's military service only through their obituaries because they mention, this person served in World War One or World War Two. But I have to say my favorite primary resource is a good old newspaper article. So that would be it for me.
And how about you, Kimberly? Regarding documentation and historical resources, what are some of the challenges that come up while working on the show? Did you have any, and did you have any of those challenges researching any of the other guests this season or in previous ones?
Yeah. In previous seasons to date, the most difficult guest that I've been assigned to research was Anita Hill because it was just an unfortunate, sort of like a perfect storm of circumstances where her family lived. They were formerly enslaved. They were in southern states. They happened to live in a part of Texas where the courthouse burned down, not once, not twice, but like three different times over a period of 40 years. Um, her research was incredibly difficult, and her family, both sides of her family, were sort of transient in the years directly after the end of the Civil War. They were moving from the East Coast more towards the Midwest, so they seemed to just sort of not be documented on a couple of census records. But she was the most difficult research. But luckily, we were able to construct most of her tree through DNA analysis, and that was really amazing to have that tool available. In season 9, this season, the clip you just saw for Brian Cox. So as Natalia said, Brian came to us wanting to know more about his maternal grandfather, specifically his maternal grandfather's service in World War One. There was some vague details slash family stories that were floating around about what his role was, what his rank was. Um, and so when I dove into the research, his family's from Scotland, and his grandfather had a fairly common surname for Scotland. And when I started looking at the available records for British, which his records would have fallen under British service members, there was like 50 men with the same name. Like I can see why it was difficult to narrow down. And so the commonality of a name can be a problem, as well as a lack of detail in available records. British records, in particular, and Scottish records, there are census records, but their birth, marriage, and death certificates are a little bit different. They don't offer as much detail as American records. They don't have the parents' names. They don't say exactly where they were born. Those little details that will make the difference. The only reason I was able to identify Brian's grandfather's military service records is we had his death certificate, and the address on the death certificate happened to match the address on a pension file that I found for a man with the same name. And I realized after I had gone through about 50 sets of records that the addresses matched. So I'm like, this has to be the same man, and it was. So it was that little detail. The other person that we struggled with a little bit this season was Viola Davis, and that's because she's from South Carolina, and I'm from South Carolina, and South Carolina is where I cut my teeth on genealogical research. So I'm quite familiar with the area. That was a huge asset. Knowing what records are available, knowing how to work those records. But South Carolina is like some other states is very late in compliance. In other words, South Carolina didn't start issuing death certificates until roughly 1917. Birth certificates even later than that. So you don't have any records to start working with until the early 20th century. And then if your ancestors were formerly enslaved or African American, you have even more brick walls to deal with. So that is probably the two types of research are quite difficult. We encounter brick walls with Jewish research, and the other is African American research, simply because the 1870 brick wall, the lack of records that were kept because people were enslaved, not considered human beings slash citizens. So we have to be creative and think outside the box to really conduct the research for those guests as thoroughly as possible and try to populate their family history as thoroughly as possible.
Wow. Tania, your organization is specifically focused on educational work on the genealogy and history of African American citizens. Could you tell us a little bit more about the Afro American Historical and Genealogical Society?
Yes, I would very much love to, because as you mentioned, that is our mission. We often refer to ourselves by the acronym OGS. So the society was founded in 1977, and we have more than 30 chapters across the country. And our goal as a society is to promote scholarly research, to provide resources to support history and genealogical study of our African ancestor, family members that came before us. We network with each other. We have opportunity to learn from each other. We learn about our successes, our challenges, our research methodologies and techniques. Because as Kimberly mentioned, there is often a brick wall when we hit 1870, and you're digging into more obscure record types, having to look into different ways of research than you might have been accustomed to prior to hitting that point. And so that is what we are here for as a society, to help our members do exactly that and tell the stories that we know need to be told.
Yes, I also have family members in family history in South Carolina, and I haven't even begun to go down and do that research. But I do have a question for all of you. Since I think you all each have a very interesting response based on different ways you approach researching family history, what do each of you think is the biggest change or has made the most impact on the genealogical research and how records and documents are discovered and used over the past 5 to 10 years? And feel free to jump in, anyone.
I'd be happy to start. That's such a good question, because we do see advances as years go by. And one of the areas that I'm particularly excited by is someone who really wants to help our family members showcase what we're learning, help each other showcase what we're learning. I, really work to try and ensure that when we find these records, find these documents, we're able to share them and showcase them in ways that are going to be long lasting, that it's there for the future. As you said at the top of the show, how do we make sure these materials are there for the long term? And as a personal family historian, that's often a challenging endeavor. So, what excites me is to see more sophisticated platforms for sharing our discoveries. We have, of course, many different opportunities or many different mechanisms available to us. But one of the trends that I'm starting to see now is the establishment of sites that allow for more permanent storage, where these are sites that are specifically and intentionally thinking about long-term legacy and long-term legacy building and passing that on. So I look forward to seeing more of that become, more highly aware from those of us that are engaged in these family history research and discoveries, and using platforms that are going to help us make sure it's available for the long term for our family members.
I think there's two things that I think have completely revolutionized genealogical research in the last decade or so. I can't decide which one has sort of been more revolutionary. The first is DNA testing, which has just blown the doors off of a lot of research problems. We are now able to. Skip always says that Dr. Gates, excuse me, always says, DNA is the dynamite to so many brick walls, and it really is. And the second thing is just so many records. The volume of records that are being digitized and available online is probably the reason why we are able to do such much more thorough and complex research than we ever could do before. I specialize in African American research. I literally stumbled into it after I discovered an old tombstone in the woods. And this is 2004. And I remember knocking on doors and going to courthouses and just that tactile research where you're digging and you're digging, you're digging. And then, the internet came around and all these websites that are geared towards research and making documents accessible. It allows, it gives an accessibility that was never there before. I've always said that African American research to me is almost like getting a puzzle to put together, but you don't have all the pieces, and you also don't know what the final result is supposed to look like. You have to figure all that out for yourself. And with all of these records being digitized, it's almost like you're getting some of the puzzle pieces that you're missing, you're getting them delivered to your door. Not all of them, but some of them. So you're able to access what you need to get more pieces much faster. It's so much easier. Um, and it, like I said, it's really revolutionized research. And it's not just official records, like that you'll find at a county courthouse or at a state archive. It's also people as a community creating these online groups, which are communities. Hey, we're having a family reunion. Hey, I mean, there's so many amazing websites. I have these old letters that I bought at an auction 25 years ago. I found these old photos of a family. I don't know who they are, and they're putting them online, saying, "Hey, this might be your family." And they're also, as Tania said, creating permanent spaces or trying to create permanent spaces where people that might have some personal family papers stashed away in their closet, you can scan them and put them online into this permanent space. And those documents that you have locked in your closet or stuck in a chest might just be the keys that somebody else needs to solve their mystery or break down their brick wall. So yeah, the digitization of records and DNA testing.
I have a document that I saved from my grandmother throwing in the trash, 1871, a deed of sale for land in Charleston, South Carolina, and just occurred to me that I could actually digitize that and put that online as well. Uh, Natalia, I wanted to go to you around this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think I just want to hone in on what both Kimberly and Tanea said and just say that when COVID hit, because of the enormous effort of all these people across the world um, digitizing records, we didn't have to shut down production, even though museums, libraries, records repositories, physical brick and mortar places were closed. We were still able to continue research and continue writing because of what's online. So we did not have to, lay people off. We did not have to go dark. We continued working through COVID and continued shooting. Of course, maybe some of the stories would have been more richer or had we had access to these brick and mortar institutions. But nevertheless, we still were able to tell amazing stories just based off of what was available to us online without having to leave our houses. So I just can't emphasize enough how revolutionary it's been. And like Kimberly said, there are stories we are telling our guests now that we couldn't tell even 5 years ago. And also just wanted to give a shout out to everyone digitizing Jewish records in Eastern Europe, all across Eastern Europe. There's been a huge effort, and the stories we are able now to tell our guests with Jewish ancestry, even 4 years ago, we could not tell them. And so huge difference in the caliber of storytelling on this show in just a few short years because of the importance of digitizing.
Yeah, I know from my own experience that it can be overwhelming when starting to track your family history and build your family tree, figuring out where to start, what types of documents to look for, where to find them. The teams at WIDA and Finding Your Roots created a great animated short that I think can help people when researching their own stories. Check out this short video about finding your own roots.
We're related to a Mexican revolutionary. Well, that's what my abuela told me.
My father is Italian, but he said my grandparents were really from Germany. I know very little about my family's history. I haven't had a lot of luck finding more information.
Every family has a story, and these 8 tips from the Finding Your Roots team can help you discover yours. So let's get started. Reach out to relatives on both sides of your family to learn about your ancestors and past events.
Abuelita, what do you know about your father?
Papa served in the military. He was was a quiet and mysterious man, always smirking, like he had a secret to tell. You know, I don't have very many pictures of him.
Whoa, he looks like me.
Finding the keepers of family photos, documents, and scrapbooks may point you toward good stories and even unsolved mysteries.
Was he part of the Mexican Revolution?
Well, actually, it was your great-great-grandmother.
Build a family tree to get a better picture of your generations over time.
Wait, she was the revolutionary?
That's right. Here, I have her marriage certificate.
Genealogy websites can help you find documents like census, military records, and birth certificates that reveal relationships to expand your family tree. And if you hit a dead end, expand your tree sideways to brothers and sisters to see whether their records reveal unknown parents, grandparents, or other clues.
Maybe with her last name, I can find out more about her.
Yes, there's a lot of stories on her side. She had a very big family.
Search for compelling stories that your loved ones will find meaningful, like immigration and wartime narratives.
Hijo, legend has it, she disguised herself as a man so that she could fight.
What? Wow, abuelita, I wish I could have met her.
I see much of her in you.
Bring in DNA results to make even deeper connections, and potentially uncover relatives in other family trees.
Dad, I got my DNA test results back. It says we're like 45% German. I thought you were Italian.
Be ethical and compassionate when asking relatives about DNA testing or when you're sharing unexpected news.
Well, I don't know very much about my family history. Maybe we should reach out to someone else in our family.
Isn't someone in our family really into tracing family trees?
Oh yeah, my aunt has been researching her family for a long time. I'll reach out to her.
Collaborate with others to share research, documents, and photos using shared storage like Google Drive, Dropbox, or other cloud service.
Wow, that was fast. She already got back to me with some links where we can share files.
Invite relatives to help with specific tasks, or team up with common DNA matches you find on genealogy websites.
Hey, your aunt sent a link to a collection of newspapers dating all the way back to the early 1800s.
Dig deep for details and use free websites such as Family Search, Chronicling America, and Google.
Dad, I can't read any of these newspapers that your aunt sent us.
Free online translation tools can help you decipher foreign language documents. But maybe your search has got you stumped. Your local library or university can be a big help.
Hi, I'm trying to learn more about my family history, but I'm not sure where to look next.
Okay, what have you found so far?
Well, I have census records that show my mother's ancestors moved from Tennessee to Oregon in the 1860s, but I don't know why.
It might have been because of the Homestead Act of 1860. That enticed many settlers to move to the American West. Let's start there and see if we can learn more.
Fill in gaps with historical context to understand the era you're researching. Even for your well-documented ancestors, it's important to understand what was happening when they were alive.
On my father's side, the tree stopped suddenly at my ancestor who was enslaved.
Well, many people were undocumented, had their names changed or taken from them, making them hard to find. A great place for you to look might be the Freedmen's Bureau records.
I can't wait to learn more and share with my family.
Create take-home mementos from the photos and documents you have collected from your research. They make great gifts for your family.
Now that we have our family tree, can we email it to the whole family?
Actually, we can share it in person at the baby shower.
Dios mío, I'm going to be a great-grandmother.
Tune in to Finding Your Roots to watch family stories unfold.
The Finding Your Roots animation mentions a few websites to use when doing research, like the Freedmen's Bureau site and Family Search, Chronicling America, and even Google. But what about social media sites? Tania, what do you think about using social media for this type of research? It's still relatively new. Do you think our future generations will look at social media when documenting their family history?
Well, I certainly hope so because social media is such a rich source of information, right? We are posting photos and documents to family groups on social media sites, to local community groups on social media sites. And then you get the benefit of having others engage in conversation and share more context and information about what it is that's being shared. So sometimes that's done in a private social media space. So there will be considerations as we think about moving forward how that can be accessed, but sometimes it's in public spaces and that becomes picked up by search engines. So there's so much information there. I do believe that it will be a rich source as we think about the future and how our future family members will be looking and trying to figure out what we had going on. What were our thoughts, our experiences? What do we know about the family? So social media provides a lot of information, and I do think it will be a source that's used in the future.
Hmm. I'm curious what you think, Kimberly, about how social media might play into your work as a genealogist.
Well, I've been utilizing social media sites for quite a while in my research, specifically social platforms like Facebook, because I used to do work before finding your roots. I used to do work for the United States Army, and one of my responsibilities was identifying living family members of soldiers who had been killed in action or whose remains had not been recovered. And I would go through social media and I would try to find them on social media and I would look at who their friends are to see if they had any other family members who were friends. And now on the show, I've realized it's an incredible resource because not just for identifying family members or contacting family members, also for finding contextual research. For Nita Hill, she was from Texas, and I was trying to better understand what was happening in Texas when her ancestors were there, why there were so many record losses. So I think I searched for, I think it was Bowie County Reconstruction History, and a historical societies page popped up. And I saw a post about a man named Cullen Baker who was murdering Freedmen's Bureau agents as well as Union sympathizers. And that post led me to start digging into Anita Hill's research and Anita Hill's ancestor because I remembered that Anita Hill's ancestor had a Freedmen's Bureau record. And I looked at the agent who created the record, and it was one of the men that Cullen Baker had killed. So there we have a historical context. We have some information for her. So I've used it that way. Also, I use it a lot to identify family members that we are working. If we're working with a guest trying to solve a DNA mystery, for instance, Pamela Adlon in season 8, her mother is alive, and her mother wanted to know the identity of her biological father, so Pamela's biological grandfather. The family was from England. It was difficult research in general, but we had a DNA match, and I was trying to find somebody that I knew lived in upstate New York, but they had no social media presence. I couldn't find a good phone number for them, but I found their grandson on LinkedIn. And I messaged him on LinkedIn, and within 10 minutes, I'm talking to the grandmother didn't, I couldn't find otherwise. And I was able to talk to her, and she's the reason why she took a DNA test, and that's why we were able to solve that mystery for Pamela Adlon's because of social media. I was able to find those people on social media. But like I said, people are posting pictures, letters, all types of information. And when someone posts a picture, as someone said, you look in the comments and people are giving context, people are explaining what's happening. It's an incredible resource. And I think it will be an important resource for many, many years to come.
Wow, some great news about social media. I have so many more questions, but we want to make sure we include our viewers here. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We've collected some questions from you all across the country over the past few days. So I'll start with one that is a great lead out from what we've just been talking about. Amy in Washington, D.C. wants to know if you have any tips for beginners who want to organize and even digitize old family photographs, which are currently in various shoeboxes and Ziplocs around the house. Tania, I think this one might be for you.
Yes, what a What a great question from Amy. I really enjoy hearing when researchers want to get their collections organized. And so I generally have 5 tips that I share for those that are just getting started. First, gather your materials so that they're all in one place. If you have them all around your house, pull them together so that you don't have to go or hunting around your house to look for them. So get them all together in one place and consolidate them. Second, once you have it gathered together, start sorting it into different groups. You can sort it by format, you can sort it by time period, you can sort it by family group, but this is going to be helpful for you in your next steps when it comes to your organization. Third, ensure you're preserving your materials in items that are not going to do harm to them long term. I know we all can relate to having those sticky photo albums where we have a picture that's stuck to those old albums and it can be difficult to remove them. So let's be sure that we're using materials that are going to be safe for our precious artifacts that we have in our families. When it comes to digitizing, use a good quality scanner if you have access to one. We can use cell phones, but if you have the ability to use a scanner, you're going to get great, consistent, and good quality images from the results of your scanning efforts. And the last tip I want to share is just, again, just as we consolidate our physical materials, consolidate your digital materials into a central hub that you can then pull from and share as you need. So, a few basic tips that are going to get you started and hopefully not be too overwhelming in the process.
Great. Digital archives might be the most challenging. Um, Next question is from Hayden in Florida. Hayden writes, I'm trying to find information on my family. My grandmother doesn't talk about her past on her mother's side. What would be the best way to get information on her childhood and where she came from? Natalia, I think this may be a good question for you to speak about learning the full picture of a family from a family tree by speaking to extended family members.
Yes, like I've said before, ask if your mother has siblings, ask all those siblings what they know. Cousins, um, anyone who's connected to that branch of your family tree, someone will know something and someone will give you a clue as to, where to take this research next. So just investigative detective work, just talk to everyone, get everyone's testimonies, everyone's accounts. And I'm sure you'll find something out that you didn't know before or that your mother hadn't shared.
These are really great questions. If you have a question you'd like to ask a future panel, please let us know in social by using hashtag finding your roots. Okay, so for our next question, Robert from Virginia would like to know, how do you find passenger ships when you know the year of immigration and the country of ancestors native land? Kimberly, any tips for uncovering this paper trail?
Yeah. So if you have, if you're trying to find information about an ancestor that you don't have a lot of information about, you have some basic details, but not a lot. Two things. The first is you're going to have to cast a really wide net. I use a lot of analogies, and that's one of my analogies. When you're going fishing, or in my case, shrimping, you cast your net as wide as you can to catch as many shrimp or fish as possible, right? So it's the same concept when you're doing research for ancestors that you don't necessarily know a lot of details about. You're going to have to cast that wide net and be prepared to dig through a lot of information to find the correct information. So with passenger manifests, if you have an ancestor who immigrated into the United States, you are going to want to go to one of the many online repositories of genealogical research and documents. There's multiple to choose from. You've got your major players, as has been pointed out before, Ancestry and Family Search and MyHeritage. Most of those sites have their records sectioned or organized by collections. So you're going to want to look for the collection of records that's typically called immigration. And within the immigration records, there should be a sub-collection called something like manifests or passenger lists. That's the collection that you're going to want to search. And when you get to the search page, there's going to be filters or key search words. You're going to want to keep it as simple as possible because you want to make sure that you're catching as much information in that net as possible. So enter the year. If you said you mentioned you know the year that they came over. So enter the year of arrival. You mentioned that you know what country they were born in. So there should be a born in search box or filter. So you can put, born in Italy or born in Greece, came to the US in 1921. If you know if it's a male or female, you can add that, but be prepared to dig. Yes, it's going to be probably a massive volume of information coming back, especially if you don't know the ancestor's name, but that's what you have to do to find what you're looking for. So you look at the results, and you're gonna start your process of elimination. You're gonna go through each single person and look at each single manifest and try to determine, is this my ancestor or not? Sometimes you can immediately identify the correct record for the person that you're looking for. Sometimes you have to start profiling each person and see if there's anything about that person that can make you eliminate them as a candidate, or something that makes you leave them in the to be considered pile. If you end up with a to be considered pile because you can't positively identify your ancestor, you're going to need to profile or trace all of those candidates forward in time and see if you can find them. Can you find them on the next census record? Can you find a death certificate for them? Can you find anything about that person that can help you eliminate them? And even then, sometimes you cannot identify your ancestor on a manifest. I could not identify Leslie Odom Jr. had a great grandfather, I believe, who was from South Africa. He had a very common name. And at the time, South Africa was a British colony. And the manifest of that time period only had a name and an age and nationality. And I can't remember his great grandfather's name, but it was really common. And I think I looked at like 100 manifests trying to figure out which one was his ancestor. And I was never able to because of the lack of detail. So, but start there. Start with the immigration collections, the passenger lists, or the manifests, and just start searching, and going through each one by one by one.
Wow, that's a lot of work, but it's certainly rewarding. Natalia, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, I had just a very important tip, I think, and Kimberly, tell me if you think so or not. But remember, when you're looking for those arrival records, the country that you're, depending on a time frame, the country that you think your ancestor was from might not have been called that at the time of arrival, right? So just an example that comes to me now because I'm working on a script from Eastern Europe. A lot of the borders have changed, both after World War I and after World War II. So the countries, so if your ancestor had arrived before World War I, say an ancestor of Jewish ancestry had arrived from what was then the Russian Empire in, say, 1915, that country is probably no longer Russia. So it's important to do some contextual history research to pinpoint what that country would have been called at the time of arrival, as opposed to now or before. So just a tip for everyone.
Right. Thank you. Great tip. So the next question is from Canada. Hannah P. would like to know, how has the digital age changed documentary formats in public history initiatives? Are digital tools creating opportunities to explore new post-colonial historical methodologies? And I think I can actually take that. Since I teach a course, family narratives, cultural shifts, and we go into the archive at least twice per semester. Um, a lot of the archivists I'm talking to have taken workshops in decolonizing the archive, and so they go back and they look at the archive and look at the notes that were recorded as part of the archive. And some of those notes might have been recorded 75 years ago, 50 years ago, or even longer. And so they think about what they're looking at and think about other ways of framing what they're seeing, whether it's a photograph or a document. And so the idea of tagging and increasing the amount of material that's tagged and diversifying it allows us to find things which may have been more hidden before. And so as I speak with my students, I tell them, just doing research in the archive means you're acting on the archive and you're contributing to the narrative around the archive. So even as you're might be researching your own family, if you come across images that you might recognize or images that might be mislabeled, that is a really good opportunity, and it would help someone else coming behind you to find something which had not been previously or accurately recorded. So I think that is something that's really great. And so whenever you go into the archive, it's really an opportunity to add to our larger story. Okay. So my next questionnaire is Colleen S. in Louisiana, and she asked if digital photographs are a blessing or a nightmare. Colleen notes that on the one hand, it might seem like a great opportunity to easily document things, but wonders if those digital snapshots across different platforms will even be accessible in the future, or can they easily be lost with the push of a button? So, Tania, do you have any thoughts about this?
Oh, yes, very valid concern from Colleen, right? Our digital photos are a blessing, but we have to take the necessary steps to protect them because they are actually more at risk than our physical photos. And so, to answer Colleen's question, I would recommend adhering to the principle of having multiple copies, right? There's a initiative in the community, lots of copies keep stuff safe. And so one of the ways we have lots of copies is to follow a backup system that we refer to as the 321 backup system. So to have at least 3 copies of all your digital materials across at least 2 different types of devices, whether it be your desktop, laptop, or an external hard drive, and to have one of those copies stored safely in the cloud to help protect from, geographic matters that may affect your collections, as we heard talked about earlier, like natural disasters. So if we adhere to a 3-2-1 backup philosophy, having those multiple copies in different locations definitely helps us protect our precious digital photos. So that's the recommendation for Colleen.
Great. And we could also print out a certain number of images a year, and so you have some
Exactly.
copies and frame them. So
Exactly.
Colleen's
Display
question.
them.
Hmm. Colleen's question relates to one we received from Carol in Southwest Virginia. What's the biggest mistake most people make when researching family history in the digital age, and how do we avoid it? And so I'll give this question to Kimberly. It's a big one to tackle. Do you have any tips on the best practices for family historians, Kimberly?
I do. And my number one piece of advice is in this digital age and in this age of social media and sharing, take everything you read or see or hear um, with a grain of salt, especially if you're looking at a public family tree for someone. Don't assume that all the information is correct. Evaluate your sources, understand how to evaluate your sources, and look into the genealogical proof standard or the GPS and make sure that all the information is lining up with those proof standards, that it's coming from reliable sources, and that you vet everything. Don't accept everything as the gospel. Try to vet it as best as you can before you uh, assume it's a fact or add it to your family history.
Good point. Thank you. So our next question comes from Waleska in Massachusetts, who'd like to know how to integrate intergenerational storytelling into their family research. Natalia, based on your work on the show, how does storytelling lend itself to sharing family history?
I mean, it's everything. I feel like I use this word a lot in our discussion, but it really, your family stories are everything. It like I think I brought up an example of societies that didn't keep records and relied on oral history. Um, and you know, our family's history is we are part of our family's history, and our family's history is ingrained in the fabric of who we are. So just ask questions, record, safekeep. And it's really where a lot of the research starts, right? The stories that we tell lead us to ask questions, lead us to want to verify, right? And lead us on these oftentimes wonderful journeys. And I think you see this season 9 that's airing now. I think one great example is Joe Manganiello, who grew up hearing a story about an ancestor who was a survivor of the Armenian genocide. And it was really ingrained in the fabric of, it still is, who he is. And he is really connected to that history. And I'm just happy that we were able to help him fill in the blanks as much as possible. But it really just starts with the stories you hear. And it's really up to you to take that further and make sure they don't get lost, right? I'm not sure if I am answering the question or getting long-winded, but yeah, I think it's the starting point. That's the stories that your family tells you, that you grow up hearing at a dinner table or during Christmas or holidays. That's everything. That's part of who you are, even whether you recognize that or not, right? They're somewhere in there in you. So that's where it starts. That's the jumping off point, as I like to call it.
Well, I think that's a great note to end the conversation on. I thank our panelists for their invaluable time and insights this evening. This was a wonderful conversation. Thank you to our host stations for this first event, WIDA and Georgia Public Broadcasting, for their much appreciated efforts in putting this event together. And the conversation doesn't end here. We hope you'll come back to join us on February 8th at 8 p.m. for the next event in the series, Genealogy and the Next Generation. And don't forget to tune in to see the remaining episodes of Season 9 of Finding Your Roots, airing on PBS Tuesdays at 8 p.m. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Get out!
Next time on Finding Your Roots, Cyndi Lauper discovers a rebel.
I know, I'm always fighting a man. Now I know where it comes from.
Jamie Chung's ancestor is honored.
No way. That's my cousin.
Yeah. And Danny Trejo's relatives journey to America.
I've got history.
And Danny, they were on foot, man.
That's heavy.
On the next Finding Your Roots.